Good evening. While the world scrambled to respond to Donald Trump's audacious capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, one country's reaction stood out for its exquisite diplomatic cowardice: India. New Delhi's response to what may be the most flagrant violation of international law in decades reveals everything you need to know about Narendra Modi's foreign policy, carefully calibrated to offend no one while standing for nothing. Let's examine what India actually said. On Sunday afternoon, more than 24 hours after American special forces extracted Maduro from Caracas, India's Ministry of External Affairs finally broke its silence with a statement expressing deep concern, but conspicuously avoiding naming Washington or condemning the military strikes. The statement emphasized support for the well-being of the Venezuelan people and called for peaceful dialogue. That was it. No mention of sovereignty, no reference to international law, no acknowledgement that a head of state had been kidnapped by a foreign power. Compare this to virtually every other major nation. Brazil's Lula called it an unacceptable affront to sovereignty and an extremely dangerous precedent. South Africa described it as a manifest violation of the UN Charter. France said it violated fundamental principles of international law. Even China, despite Trump claiming Xi wouldn't object, condemned the use or threat of force. Russia, for all its limitations, at least called it armed aggression. And India? Deep concern, as if Trump had merely tweeted something inappropriate rather than invaded a sovereign nation. The contrast with India's own communist parties is particularly striking. In a joint statement, the CPI, CPIM, and several other left parties strongly denounced what they accurately termed the kidnapping of Maduro, accused Trump of laying bare his intentions to capture Venezuela's oil reserves, and explicitly called on the government of India to join countries worldwide in condemning U.S. aggression. The left party showed more moral clarity in one paragraph than the Modi government managed in its entire statement. Now, let's be clear about what this reveals. India's refusal to name the United States or condemn the operation wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was a calculated decision to avoid upsetting Washington while maintaining just enough distance to claim neutrality. It's the foreign policy equivalent of mumbling something vaguely disapproving while carefully ensuring no one can actually hear what you said. This approach fits perfectly with Modi's much-vaunted multi-alignment strategy, the idea that India can maintain good relations with everyone by never committing to anything concrete. Want to be part of the Quad with America, Japan, and Australia? Sure. Want to buy Russian oil and weapons while Russia invades Ukraine? Absolutely. Want to lecture others about sovereignty while saying nothing when America kidnaps a head of state? Why not? The problem with multi-alignment is that it only works until someone forces you to choose. And in this case, India chose. It chose American favor over principle. The Ministry of External Affairs couldn't even bring itself to mention that a military invasion had occurred, instead referring vaguely to developments in Venezuela, as if Maduro had simply decided to take an impromptu trip to New York. Consider the practical implications. India has consistently positioned itself as a champion of the global South, a defender of sovereignty for developing nations, and a voice for the non-aligned world order. India regularly invokes these principles when criticizing Western interventionism or defending its own positions. But when confronted with the starkest example of Western military aggression in years, New Delhi's response amounted to, "We're deeply concerned about something. Please dialogue." The timing makes this even more pathetic. India is currently chairing the G20 and has spent years building its credentials as a responsible global power. This was an opportunity to demonstrate genuine leadership, to stand with other major democracies like Brazil in defending basic principles of international law. Instead, India produced a statement so carefully worded it could have been drafted by a committee terrified of accidentally expressing an opinion. What makes this particularly frustrating is that India had nothing to gain from this cowardice. It's not as if Trump was going to reward New Delhi's silence with trade concessions or military aid. America's relationship with India is driven by strategic competition with China, not by India's willingness to look the other way when America kidnaps a head of state. India could have condemned the operation without jeopardizing any vital interests. But Modi's government has consistently prioritized the appearance of good relations with Washington over actually standing for anything. During Trump's first term, Modi held massive rallies for him in India. When Trump visited, India rolled out the red carpet for a man who regularly insulted Indian Americans and implemented policies harmful to Indian interests. The pattern is clear. When forced to choose between principle and proximity to power, Modi chooses proximity every time. The statement's language is also revealing. By emphasizing the well-being of the Venezuelan people and calling for dialogue, India managed to implicitly validate the American narrative that this operation was somehow about helping Venezuelans rather than seizing oil and asserting dominance. Never mind that the Venezuelan people weren't consulted about having their capital bombed and their head of state kidnapped. Never mind that Trump explicitly stated America would run Venezuela and exploit its oil reserves. India's statement treats this as a dispute requiring dialogue rather than an act of aggression requiring condemnation. Even India's advisory to its nationals to avoid non-essential travel to Venezuela was framed purely as a safety concern, with no acknowledgement why Venezuela might suddenly be unsafe, as if the bombs just appeared spontaneously rather than being dropped by American aircraft. The global response to India's weak statement has been notably quiet, which tells its own story. When you craft a response so bland and meaningless that even the country you're defending doesn't notice you've defended them, you've achieved a special kind of diplomatic irrelevance. Venezuela won't be thanking India for its support, but America won't be thanking India either, because everyone understands that India's statement was motivated purely by fear rather than friendship. This matters because it exposes the fundamental hollowness of India's claims to global leadership. You cannot lead the global south while refusing to defend it when it's attacked. You cannot champion sovereignty while staying silent when it's violated. You cannot claim to support international law while carefully avoiding mentioning it when it's breached. Leadership requires the courage to state uncomfortable truths even when they might upset powerful friends. Compare India's approach to that of nations with genuine principles. Brazil risks American displeasure by condemning the operation clearly and directly. South Africa calls out violations of the UN Charter regardless of who commits them. Even smaller Latin American nations like Mexico and Chile found the courage to explicitly reject the intervention. These countries understand that standing for something occasionally requires standing against someone. India's response also undermines its long-standing criticism of Western double standards. How can New Delhi credibly complain about selective application of international law when it selectively applies it itself? How can India criticize the West for ignoring sovereignty when convenient while doing precisely the same thing? The answer is it can't. This statement has damaged India's credibility as a voice for principled multilateralism. The tragedy is that this was entirely predictable. India has spent years perfecting the art of saying nothing while appearing to say something, of positioning itself as neutral while actually tilting to whoever seems most powerful at the moment. The Venezuela statement is simply the latest example of a pattern that has defined Modi's foreign policy. Maximize flexibility, minimize commitment, and never ever take a clear stand that might upset anyone important. What India should have said is straightforward, that while the Maduro regime was authoritarian and illegitimate, the use of military force to kidnap a head of state violates fundamental principles of international law and sets a dangerous precedent that threatens all nations' sovereignty.
that India supports the Venezuelan people's right to determine their own future through peaceful democratic means, not through foreign military intervention, that dialogue and diplomacy, not bombs and kidnappings, are the appropriate tools for resolving disputes between nations. This wouldn't have been complicated or controversial, it's essentially what dozens of other countries said, but it would have required India to actually stand for something, and that's apparently too much to ask for. The tragedy is that India has the potential to be a genuine leader in the international system, a large democracy with historical ties to the non-aligned movement and sufficient strategic weight to speak independently. But leadership requires more than size and potential. It requires courage, principle, and the willingness to defend your values even when it's inconvenient.
Instead, India chose to issue a statement so carefully neutered that it offended no one while impressing no one. It's the foreign policy equivalent of showing up to a debate and saying, "I have thoughts about this issue," before sitting down without sharing any of them. The left parties got it right in their statement. The government of India should have joined voices worldwide in condemning US aggression. They didn't because Modi's government valued American favor over Venezuelan sovereignty, flexibility over principle, and diplomatic convenience over moral clarity. That's the analysis for tonight. India's response to the Venezuela crisis won't change anything materially. Neither Washington nor Caracas particularly care what New Delhi thinks, but it has clarified something important. When the moment came to demonstrate the leadership India constantly claims to provide, Modi's government produced a statement notable only for its cowardice. That's not multi-alignment, that's just weakness dressed up as strategy.